Are you seeing my screen? Yes? Okay. So I'm going to talk about chapters 3 and 4 of Fratelli Tutti. And the way I read it, and the reason I picked that song to begin with, is because I'm seeing this as an invitation to full communion. The way I read this, or at least the way I'm going to approach it, is I saw three basic major themes: a theological anthropology, the morality that flows from it, and the more practical sides of creating communion. Now, I'm going to send Don a PDF with these slides, so you don't need to worry too much about keeping track of them. Theological anthropology. I think a simpler way of saying it is just who do we think we are? This is what Francis is going to give us as a view of the human person. Human beings are so made that they cannot live and find fulfillment except in the sincere gift of self to others. This is part of the mystery of authentic human existence. Life exists where there is bonding, where there is communion. You know, I always love to play with the idea. Descartes, of course, said, "I think, therefore I am." And what he missed in that was that he wouldn't have even had words had his grandmother not taught him to say it. He was a person because others treated him as a person, and he was in reciprocal relationship with others. So we are essentially communal beings. And this is where Francis is starting. The world exists for everyone. And because all of us were born with the same dignity, there's no essential difference in the way we come out of the womb. So he goes on to say differences of color, religion, talent, place of birth or residence, and so many others cannot be used to justify the privileges of some over the rights of all. As a community, we have an obligation to ensure that every person lives with dignity and has sufficient opportunities for his or her integral development. Now, the numbers that you'll see there are referring to paragraph numbers of Fratelli Tutti. I think we all kind of know this, more than kind of, believe this, but it's always good to keep going back to say, what is it that he's asking? No one then can remain excluded because of his or her place of birth, much less because of the privileges enjoyed by others who were born in lands of greater opportunity. Don, I'm not sure if there are people who are wanting to join that I can't see. And he says, and it is unacceptable that some have fewer rights by virtue of being women. And while our church is fabulous in proclaiming the universality of human being, the rights of everyone, this is our Achilles heel, the place where we really fall apart, I think, in our own estimation as well as that of the world. Now, I've practiced how to say this word that he uses, and I think it's Agathusin. It's a great Greek word that he throws in there. He also translates it as close to what we mean by benevolence in Latin, or benevolencia or something like that. But he says, this is what we're called to. And I think here we're seeing some of his Jesuit roots come out. the pursuit of the good, finding God in all things, and for the greater ad majorem gloria, striving for excellence. This is what a human being is made to be, according to Francis. The cultivation of values, not simply material well-being. Seeing and pursuing the good of others and of the entire human family. Helping individuals and societies to mature in the moral values that foster human development. And I think this is where he's talking, without necessarily saying so, to the new epic of history that I really think we're on the cusp of. It may have started 30 or 40 years ago, but I really think that some of the reactionaryism that we're seeing in today's world is because people have a gut sense that everything is changing, and yet they don't know how to keep their balance in it. And I think this is what Francis is calling us to. Remember, this encyclical is addressed to us in thinking about the post-pandemic world. So our call is to help individuals and societies mature in the moral values that foster integral human development. He talks about this virtue as a yearning for goodness. And I think that's really appropriate in this time of Advent, to allow ourselves to get caught into the yearning for goodness, an inclination toward all that is fine and excellent, a desire to fill the lives of others with what is beautiful, sublime, and edifying. This is the beauty. I think sometimes we think about the prophetic call as rather dour-faced. Jeremiah got a reputation for being a complainer, but the prophecy that he's calling us to is to get people caught up in what's beautiful and truly edifying. So that moves right into promoting the moral good. He says the mere fact that people are born in places with fewer resources or less development does not justify the fact that they are living with less dignity. So it does not justify the fact that they are living with less dignity. And the converse, being born into plenty, is a responsibility, not a privilege. So, looking at the hungry and Dorothy Day, who was a call to be more. So I liked this as sort of the rule of thumb. Francis will say every virtue is measured on how its practice fosters openness and union with others. And there he was talking a bit about how we could be just, we could be prudent, we could be practicing all kinds of virtues. But the real measure of them is how they promote unity, how they promote communion, how they promote a world that is vastly more inclusive. And so he says, this is where he gets really radical. And he's not saying anything new, but the principle of the common use of created goods, is the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. It is a natural and inherent right that takes priority over others. The right to private property can only be considered as a secondary right derived from the principle of the universal destination of created goods. This has concrete consequences that ought to be reflected in the workings of society. Yet it often happens that secondary rights displace primary and overriding rights, in practice, making them irrelevant. He goes on to say, nowadays, a firm belief in the common destination of the earth's good requires that this principle also be applied to nations. We can say that each country also belongs to the foreigner, inasmuch as a territory's goods must not be denied to a needy person coming from elsewhere. As the bishops of the United States have taught, there are fundamental rights that precede any society because they flow from the dignity granted to each person by God. So then we move into the practical, creating communion. You know, and these are not exactly separate. The moral is not separate from the theological anthropology, which is not separate from the practical steps of creating. Love impels us, he tells us, toward universal communion. By its very nature, love calls for growth in openness and the ability to accept others as part of a continuing adventure that makes every periphery converge in a greater sense of mutual belonging. Just take that in for a moment. Every periphery is going to converge into a greater sense of mutual belonging. Our response to the arrival of migrating persons can be, or should be, summarized by 4 words: welcome, protect, promote, integrate. Would that we were seeing that happen in our country as well as the other wealthy nations of the world. So then he moves into talking about solidarity. He says solidarity is a moral virtue born of personal conversion. It's an awareness that we are responsible for the fragility of others as we strive to build a common future. As I was thinking about this, I thought about a friend of mine, one of our sisters who for years worked with L'Arche and is now in another community much like that. And what occurred to me was the more we move into real union, into real communion with very fragile people, the more we recognize our own fragility and maybe become less afraid of it. A few weeks ago, I think David Brooks had a great editorial on, or commentary on, our human fragility. But if we can accept it and be unafraid of it, we've got a great basis for building communion. The picture here is from the recent protests in Peru. Those of you who aren't aware, in a week, Peru went through 3 presidents. The Congress deposed the president and named someone else who was unacceptable to the nation. And largely the young people led the protests in the streets to the point that that president resigned and the Congress named someone else who everybody has great hope in. But Francis tells us solidarity, understood in its most profound meaning, is a way of making history. And this is what popular movements are doing. You know, I'm not sure that I had ever thought of it exactly that way, but the way we can make history today is going to be through solidarity. And solidarity will make it a different kind of history. Beware, or let's say beware, I loved his phrase, cultural sclerosis. Hardening of the heart, hardening of the arteries, hardening of the vision so that you don't see beyond your own place. The antidote to that, he says, is to discover the gifts of each person, to promote that which unites us, and to regard our differences as an opportunity to grow in mutual respect. That kind of jumps back to a previous phrase where he talked about the adventure of setting off together in solidarity, the adventure of creating community with people who are not part of our original group or tribe. He began then to talk about reciprocal gifts. And he talks about that in, at least in paragraphs 103 and 130. But this little piece is a bit of my reflection on it more than just what Francis was saying. The question of women, of so many people, was in the back of my mind, and the difference between what people have talked about, the complementarity of groups or reciprocity. And in complementarity, I think we often think of one fills out what is lacking in the other. So we need the complementarity of migrant workers because we don't have the people willing or able or willing to do that work. The feminine genius is that which fills in that little bit lacking in the male side. But that's not pulling in the person, accepting the person as a whole. It's saying, here's the hole you can plug. Reciprocity, on the other hand, is built in mutuality. It's relationship which builds us all up. Real reciprocity is, I think, another form of communion that transforms us and creates of us bigger, more human creatures. And so when he's talking about seeing our reciprocal gifts, I think he's really aiming at saying there is something that we have to give one another that changes all of us, that makes all of us bigger and more human. So that's kind of my quick run through these 2 chapters of Fratelli Tutti, an invitation to full communion. And now I think, Don, if you'll take over again, we've got some time for small group discussion, no?
Yes, we do. Thank you very much.
Huh?
I'm just reclaiming the host now.
And?
Hey, Mary, nice job.
Thank you.
Giving a great overview of those 2 chapters.
I'm no longer sharing screen, correct?
And no longer sharing screen, right?
Good.
Actually, I'm still seeing your screen.
Okay.
So
then.
Why don't we leave that for a second, and we'll
okay. It's not a bad
while we go into the breakout rooms. So Mary broke open these two chapters, focusing on kind of the three major themes: theological anthropology, um, kind of a moral guide or a moral life, and then a call to communion. So we're going to give you about 10 minutes in your groups. We're just going to be doing it randomly. And the questions there is, what resonated with you as you were listening to Mary speak, or your own reflections on Fratelli Tutti? What's resonating with you today? What are you finding really attractive? So let me put us into breakout rooms. Going to we have 30 people, so going to put a room. Okay, welcome. Let me, if someone has, as someone willing to kind of share a little bit about what you heard in your group, and I think I'm just going to kind of pick folks randomly. Megan, I'm going to choose you first simply because my hand is on top of your picture there at the bottom. Megan, were you able to be in a group, and can you just summarize a little bit about what your group shared?
Sure, I was in a group, yeah. We all kind of spoke about, you gotta give me a minute, a chance to think about it. Well, I guess I can speak from, there was a sense of practicality in this. I mean, we recognize the value of thinking and reflecting on the theological elements of the way that Mary presented it. And I have to admit, personally, this was way deeper than I went when I read it the first time. But that there was a very practical sense, very specific ways that, for example, Pope Francis identifies ways to promote and support, welcome, protect, promote, integrate immigrants and migrants. That will probably be a challenge for folks, for everyone. But in this country will be a challenge for some. And we spoke about how this really speaks so much to the pandemic as well, and how it has played out some of these inequalities that are, we're not quite to these ideals. And so it's a real challenge to that sense of reciprocity that we can eventually reach. So, thank you.
Megan, thanks. Someone else, would you be willing to volunteer and just kind of summarize a little bit about what your group talked about? No fair being from Megan's group. Anyone? People are being shy.
In our group,
oh, Claire, good.
In our group, we had talked about values such as truth, morality. I didn't write them down, but the good values that can bring us to communion with one another, and how we can, not necessarily practicality, but I guess it's just like the values, the good, strong values. Nobody said anything about history, but I think if you knew history, you would try not to repeat it. I think that's very basic. Nobody mentioned it, but that's what I thought. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thank you, Claire. Someone else?
Well, our group talked a lot about the common good, particularly when it comes to migrants. What struck me as his statement, Pope Francis' statement, that every country also belongs to the foreigner. Gerald Kelly talked about the common good and our obsession with private property and individualism in this country that has to be overturned, and how we have to look at our brothers' needs and tend to them. We talked about the principle that, you know, any country's policy takes second place to the needs of the people who are in greater need. How you know, people born into privilege have a responsibility, but we have to, you know, we have to examine ourselves as well and see what are our biases, and, you know, what are our attitudes and behaviors that need to change. And one of the Bernardine Franciscans, who were, you know, and en masse part of our breakout room, I think I said we had the biggest breakout room of all, which is, you know, reiterated that as missionaries, we have to remember that we are not the superior, you know, culture coming to save the people in mission territory. We are there to work with them and learn from each other. So it was a lot of, like I said, we focus very much on the common good and self-examining, you know, ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Roberto. Anyone else?
I can speak for we spoke a little bit about solidarity and just the resonance that had with many of the folks in our group. And then we really tried to grapple with, there's a line that Pope Francis uses that talks about being responsible for the fragility of others. And some of the challenge that calls us to, and I guess some of the risk that having the right mindset and attitude as we think about that, right, where hopefully we're recognizing that we're part of the problem, and hopefully part of the solution, but working to avoid attitudes that seek to control or dictate or dominate in those relationships, right? So recognizing kind of the desire to stand with the other, and share some responsibility for that fragility. So I don't know, Roseanne, if I got that right, feel free to correct for me.
Thanks. Anyone else? Okay. Mary, as you've kind of heard some of the conversation, any further thoughts that you'd like to kind of reinforce or stress? You have to unmute yourself.
Well, I was just listening, not so much thinking about it, you know, thinking about coming back with something. But I think underneath it all, at least these parts that I just dealt with, is the call to inclusion, to communion, you know, which is another one dimension of that is the common good. You know, it was an interesting conversation that we got to. I was in the same group as Barbara and Roseanne and Adam and William. But when we talked about responsibility for the fragile, part of that came back to the reciprocity, because of that sense of we are all in this together, and what the strong have to learn from the fragile. So, you know, I think we may say common good. You know, I just opened this up, and no one can be excluded because there is no reason for it. But maybe if I'm going to go on thinking about something more, it's probably that right now for Advent, that learning to yearn for goodness, the inclination toward all that's fine and excellent, and the desire to fill the lives of others with what's beautiful, sublime, and edifying. You know, if that's our approach to the fragile,
Mm.
and to receive from the fragile, to receive from the other, as much as to share what we have, I think we're on our way to being Fratelli Tutti.
Great, Mary. Thank you. Joan, did you have something that you wanted to share? Unmute yourself.
Just, I think it's a kind of an interesting thing. In the Washington Post this week, there was a review of a book called Morality, which is written by Jeffrey Sachs. And he deals with the same issues that the Pope is talking about. He wrote it for his children and grandchildren, but it's now become, available here in the U.S. Of course, he was a chief rabbi in England and a great spokesperson for the poor. But he talks about this whole need to bring back morality into our society. And I thought it was rather fortuitous that I had just read that.
And the reference to that one more time?
It's a book called Morality by Jeffrey Sachs, S-A-C-H-S. I don't know who it's published by, but it was a review in the Washington Post this Sunday, past Sunday. Takes me a whole week to read that.
Yeah. Great. Good. We have just a few minutes left. Anyone else care to raise a question or a thought? Yes, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, Sister Christine, Maria made a good point. She says, we've become lazy in trying to identify, deeper issues. And she said, because we've taught so well over the years about the Catholic Church having the full truth, that we need to be listening to what the magisterium has to say, and there's not a lot of room for questions. And so she properly, pointed out that I think that yes, people are we're suffering from that now. It's we have all the truth, and we don't need to discuss that. Then I added to with my students teaching at Xavier for 25 years now. I've been surprised how many kids come out of there not even think of the term social analysis. We can learn about all these different facts, but yet how many of us take the time to look deeper and say, well, what is the cause why does Black Lives Matter become so important? Why does that seem to be so new when supposedly in Catholic social teaching, we've been pointing out the importance not only of common good, but to do the deeper analysis as to where do these isms come from? Why are women treated the way they are? What's behind all this? So I thought that was a really important thing Sister Maria pointed out to us. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Mike. Just speaking of pointing things out, couple of thoughts. One is, of course, today is the feast day of St. Francis Xavier. And I thought we've also just celebrated the 40th anniversary of the death of the 4 martyrs in El Salvador, the sisters and Jean Donovan. So certainly are mindful of them. One of the things that is mentioned by Pope Francis at one part in Fratelli Tutti is not only do we need to be reaching out to open to people from around the globe, but also to our predecessors, be mindful of those who have gone before us and to learn from their witness. So, in terms of witness, next week we have chapter 5 and chapter 6. I'm open to anybody who would like to collaborate with me. I've got chapter 5 done, but not chapter 6. So if anybody would like to collaborate with me on chapter 6 for next week, just send me an email or put that in the chat function, and I will follow up with you. And Mike, have you decided yet? I'm putting you on the spot. You think you might be able to do chapters 7 and 8 for us?
What does it pay?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I promise you I won't harass you for the rest of the month.
Well, how many days out of purgatory will I get?
As many as you need.
Oh, I don't know if there's enough. No, Don, if you, I'd be glad to collaborate with you. I have enough going on here, but
Okay,
we
I
can
hear
collaborate.
you.
Yes, I'll say yes.
Yeah, it wasn't fair to put you on the spot.
Nice job.
So, but anybody, again, anyone who is open to collaborating. I really want to thank you, Mary. Mary kind of stepped up at the last minute, and this was really the only time that she could be with us for this series, and I really appreciate it, Mary. I thought you did a great job of summarizing two very dense chapters. Yeah, Roberto, yes, applauds, you know, bravo. So with that, Joan, I'm going to turn to you. You do a great job of bringing our sessions to a close with a prayer. Would you be willing to do that one more time?
Yes, I'll do it spontaneously.
Great.
I don't have any prayer ready, right? That I can get fast. Loving God, we thank you for bringing us together to reflect on these important words from Pope Francis. We ask that you help us to let them sink deep into our hearts, and that we continue to reflect on them, especially during this time of Advent, so that we are able to reach out and to include all of the people in our world who need a home, a heart, a listening ear. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. God bless everyone. Thanks very much. See you next week.